14-year-old murders his entire family and smiles. Then the judge destroys his future in one sentence. 14 years old. That's the age when most kids are worried about homework and video games. But on a cold night in November, one teenager stood in an interrogation room with a smirk that chilled every detective in the building. He had just ended 4 lives: his mother, his father, his brother, and his sister. The bodies were still being photographed when he laughed. Not cried, not trembled. Laughed. He believed his age would shield him from consequences. He thought the system would protect a child. But the courtroom would soon teach him a lesson he never saw coming. Sometimes monsters wear braces. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. If you believe in accountability, subscribe now and tell us what you think below. This is how it all began. The house sat on a quiet street where neighbors knew each other's names. White picket fence, trimmed hedges. The kind of place where nothing bad ever happened, until it did. On the evening of November 7th, police received a call from a frantic neighbor who heard screaming. By the time officers arrived, the house was silent, too silent. Inside, they discovered a scene that would haunt them forever. 4 bodies, a family erased in a single night. And in the living room, sitting calmly on the couch, was the 14-year-old son. He wasn't crying. He wasn't shaking. He was scrolling through his phone. When officers asked what happened, he shrugged. 3 words that would echo through the investigation. "I don't know." The interrogation room was small and gray, lit by a single fluorescent bulb that buzzed like an angry insect. Detective Sarah Morrison sat across from the boy, studying his face for any sign of emotion. There was none. His name was Kyle Anderson, and he looked like any other kid his age. Braces on his teeth, a video game logo on his shirt, sneakers that cost more than most people's rent. But his eyes told a different story. They were flat, empty, like looking into a frozen lake where nothing lived beneath the surface. Sarah had been doing this job for 17 years. She had interviewed killers, abusers, and monsters of every kind. But she had never seen someone so young look so utterly devoid of humanity. Kyle leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, one leg bouncing with nervous energy or maybe boredom. Sarah couldn't tell which. She placed a folder on the table between them. Inside were photographs. Crime scene images that no mother should ever have to identify, no father should ever have to claim. Kyle glanced at the folder but didn't reach for it. He knew what was inside. Of course he knew. He had been there. He had created the scene those photographs captured. Sarah opened the folder slowly, deliberately, watching his face for a crack in the armor. Nothing. She slid the first photo across the table, a woman's hand, pale and lifeless, reaching toward a doorway she would never cross. Kyle looked at it the way someone might look at a grocery list. "That's your mother," Sarah said quietly. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she placed another photo beside the first. "Your father." Another photo. "Your brother Marcus. He was 12. One more. And your sister Emma. She was only 8 years old, Kyle." The boy's expression didn't change. He picked at a loose thread on his jeans. Sarah felt her stomach turn. She had children of his own age. She couldn't imagine sitting across from them like this, couldn't imagine them capable of something so unspeakable. But here he was, real, human, and completely unmoved by the destruction he had caused. "Do you understand why you're here?" Sarah asked. Kyle shrugged. It was a gesture so casual, so dismissive, that it felt like a slap. "I guess because they think I did something," he said. His voice was flat, monotone, like he was reading from a script he found boring. Sarah leaned forward, her elbows on the table. "Kyle, 4 people are gone. Your entire family. Don't you want to know what happened to them?" The boy finally looked up and met her eyes. For a moment, Sarah thought she saw something flicker there, recognition maybe, understanding. But then it was gone, replaced by that same hollow stare. "I already know what happened," Kyle said. "They're gone, and nothing I say is going to bring them back." The room fell silent except for the buzz of that fluorescent light. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. This wasn't denial. This wasn't shock or trauma or a child's inability to process grief. This was something else entirely, something darker. She had seen killers try to manipulate investigations before, seen them fake tears and remorse to gain sympathy. But Kyle wasn't even trying. He didn't care enough to pretend. That realization hit Sarah like a punch to the chest. This boy had no remorse because he felt no guilt. And that made him more dangerous than any adult criminal she had ever faced. "Where were you when it happened?" Sarah asked, changing tactics. Kyle tilted his head slightly, considering the question. "Home," he said simply. "Did you see anything? Hear anything?" Another shrug. "Not really. I was in my room playing games with my headphones on. Didn't hear anything until the police showed up." His story was rehearsed. Too smooth, too convenient. Sarah had heard 1,000 lies in her career, and this was one of them. But lies required proof to unravel, and right now all she had were photographs and a gut feeling that the boy sitting across from her was responsible for every drop of blood in that house. Sarah gathered the photos and placed them back in the folder. She stood up, looking down at Kyle with a mixture of disgust and pity. "We're going to find out what happened," she said. "Every detail, every second. And when we do, there won't be anywhere left to hide." Kyle looked up at her, and for the first time since entering the room, he smiled. It wasn't a nervous smile or a scared smile. It was the smile of someone who thought they had already won. "Good luck with that," he said. Sarah walked out of the interrogation room and closed the door behind her. On the other side, she leaned against the wall and took a deep breath. Her partner, Detective Mike Chen, was waiting with 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one, and she took it gratefully, her hands still shaking. "Well?" Mike asked. Sarah shook her head. "He's guilty," she said quietly, "and he doesn't care if we know it." The Anderson family had lived on Maple Drive for 6 years. It was the kind of neighborhood where kids rode bikes until streetlights came on and adults waved to each other over morning coffee. Everyone knew the Andersons. Jennifer Anderson, the mother, taught 3rd grade at the local elementary school. Parents loved her because she remembered every child's name and always had extra pencils in her desk. She baked cookies for school fundraisers and volunteered at the community center every Saturday. Her smile was genuine, the kind that made you feel seen and valued. She had built a life around caring for others, never imagining that the greatest threat would come from inside her own home. David Anderson, the father, worked as an accountant for a mid-sized firm downtown. He wasn't flashy or loud, but he was dependable. Neighbors remembered him mowing his lawn every Sunday morning, always offering to help if someone needed an extra hand. He coached Marcus's soccer team and never missed one of Emma's dance recitals. David was the kind of father who showed up, who kept promises, who believed that consistency and love were enough to raise good kids. He had been wrong about one of them. On the evening of November 7th, David had come home from work at his usual time carrying takeout pizza because Jennifer had a parent-teacher conference that ran late. He walked through his front door expecting a normal Thursday night. He never walked out. Marcus was 12 years old and obsessed with skateboarding. His room was covered in posters of professional skaters, and his prized possession was a custom board his parents had saved up to buy him for his birthday. He was shy at school but came alive at the skate park, where older kids respected his dedication and improving skills. Marcus looked up to his older brother Kyle, followed him around like a shadow when they were younger. But lately, things had changed. Marcus had started spending more time in his own room, keeping his distance. Friends later said Marcus seemed quieter in the weeks before his life ended, like something was weighing on him, like he knew something was coming but didn't know how to stop it. Emma was 8 years old and everything her mother had been at that age. Bright, curious, always asking questions that adults struggled to answer. Why is the sky blue? Where do thoughts come from? If you could be any animal, what would you be? She loved butterflies and had a collection of books about them, each page worn from repeated reading. Emma's teacher described her as empathetic, the kind of child who noticed when someone was sad and tried to help. She drew pictures for classmates who seemed lonely and shared her lunch with anyone who forgot theirs. Emma believed in goodness, in fairness, in a world where kindness mattered. She died believing in those things. She died never understanding why her own brother would destroy everything she loved. The house itself told a story of normalcy that made the tragedy even harder to comprehend. Family photos lined the hallway, documenting birthdays and holidays and ordinary moments worth preserving. The kitchen still smelled faintly of Jennifer's lavender candles. Emma's backpack sat by the front door, homework half finished, and waiting for a Monday morning that would never come. Marcus's skateboard leaned against the garage wall. David's coffee mug, still half full, sat on the kitchen counter with a ring stain that would never be wiped away. These were the details that broke people. Not the violence itself, but the interrupted lives, the future that had been stolen, the memories that would never be made. Neighbors gathered on the street the morning after, standing behind yellow police tape and trying to make sense of the impossible. Margaret Collins, who lived 3 houses down, kept repeating the same phrase over and over. They were such a good family, such a good family. She had seen Jennifer just 2 days earlier, chatting about the upcoming school winter concert. Everything had seemed fine, normal, safe. How do you recognize evil when it sits at your dinner table every night? How do you protect yourself from a threat that shares your DNA and calls you Mom? These were questions the neighborhood would wrestle with for years, questions that had no satisfying answers. The memorial that appeared on the Andersons' lawn grew throughout the week. Flowers, stuffed animals, handwritten notes from students who would miss Mrs. Anderson's encouraging words, teammates who would miss Marcus's quiet determination, dance classmates who would miss Emma's infectious laughter. But no one left anything for Kyle. His name was whispered, not spoken aloud. Parents pulled their children closer when they passed the house, as if proximity to tragedy might be contagious. The community struggled with a truth they didn't want to accept. Monsters aren't always strangers in dark alleys. Sometimes they're children, sometimes they live in houses just like yours. Sometimes they destroy everything beautiful without ever explaining why. Jennifer's sister, Rachel, was the one who had to identify the bodies. She walked into the morgue on Friday morning and walked out a different person. The grief was expected. The anger was natural. But what surprised her most was the guilt. Rachel kept thinking about the last time she had seen her sister, just 3 weeks earlier at a family barbecue. Kyle had been there, quiet and distant as usual. Rachel had noticed but said nothing. She thought he was just being a moody teenager. Now she replayed that day over and over, searching for signs she had missed, warning signals she should have caught. But there had been nothing obvious, nothing that screamed danger. Kyle had eaten a burger, played on his phone, left early because he was bored, and Rachel had let him go without a second thought. The investigation would eventually reveal cracks in the perfect family portrait. Arguments about Kyle's grades, concerns about his behavior at school, a recent suspension for threatening another student. But from the outside, the Andersons had looked functional. Maybe not perfect, but trying, loving, committed to making it work. And that's what made it so terrifying. If this could happen to them, it could happen to anyone. There was no formula for prevention, no checklist that guaranteed safety. Sometimes, despite every effort and every ounce of love, something inside a person breaks in ways that can't be fixed. The Anderson family had done their best. They had loved their children, provided for them, tried to raise them right. And it hadn't been enough, because you can't love someone into having a conscience. You can't parent empathy into existence. And Kyle Anderson had been born missing something fundamental that makes us human. The first officer through the door was a rookie named Daniel Hayes. He had been on the force for 8 months and had responded to domestic disturbances, car accidents, and noise complaints. Nothing had prepared him for what waited inside the Anderson house. The front door was unlocked, swinging open easily when he pushed. The entryway looked normal, shoes lined up neatly by the door, a coat rack with jackets still hanging. But the silence was wrong. Houses with families have sounds, televisions, voices, the hum of life happening. This house had none of that. Daniel called out, identifying himself as police. No response. He moved deeper inside, his hand instinctively moving to his weapon. And then he saw the first body. David Anderson lay in the hallway between the kitchen and living room. He had collapsed face down, one arm stretched forward as if reaching for something just beyond his grasp. The back of his head showed the fatal wound, a trauma so severe that Daniel had to look away. Blood had pooled beneath the body, soaking into the carpet and spreading outward in a dark stain that looked black under the dim lighting. David's wallet was still in his back pocket, his wedding ring still on his finger. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't a break-in gone wrong. This was something far more personal. Daniel radioed for backup, his voice shaking slightly as he reported what he had found. Then he forced himself to continue through the house. Jennifer Anderson was in the kitchen. She had fallen near the refrigerator, surrounded by the contents of the pizza box David had brought home. Pepperoni slices scattered across the tile floor, some soaked in blood. Her phone was clutched in her right hand, screen cracked but still glowing with an unsent message. The forensics team would later recover that message, typed in her final moments. Just 3 words that never got delivered. "Help us, please." Jennifer had known what was happening, had tried to stop it, had failed. The positioning of her body suggested she had turned to face her attacker, maybe trying to reason with them, maybe trying to understand. She died looking into the eyes of someone she had carried for 9 months and loved for 14 years. Marcus was found in his bedroom. The skateboard posters watched silently as investigators documented the scene. The boy had been struck while sitting at his desk, apparently doing homework. His math textbook was still open, pencil still in his hand. Blood spatter covered the pages, obscuring the equations he would never finish. Marcus's door had been closed, but not locked. He hadn't expected danger from inside his own home, hadn't thought to protect himself from his own brother. The detectives who processed his room noted the younger boy's collections, comic books, action figures, evidence of a childhood that ended violently and without warning. On his desk, beneath the textbook, they found a journal. The last entry was dated 2 days before his death. "Kyle's been acting weird again. Hope he's okay." Emma's room was the hardest for everyone who entered. Pink walls covered with butterfly stickers she had carefully placed herself. A canopy bed with stuffed animals arranged precisely the way she liked them. She had been found tucked under her covers, as if sleeping. But the blood on her pillow told a different story. Emma had been the last. The forensics team could reconstruct the timeline based on blood patterns and body temperatures. David first, ambushed when he entered. Jennifer second, when she heard the commotion and came to investigate. Marcus third, killed quickly before he could fully understand what was happening. And Emma last, after the others were gone. She had likely heard everything, had known her entire family was being destroyed, and then her door had opened, and her brother had walked in. The weapon was found in the garage, tossed carelessly on top of David's workbench. A baseball bat, aluminum, standard sporting equipment that could be purchased at any store in America. It was covered in blood and hair, physical evidence that would later be matched to all 4 victims. The bat had belonged to Marcus, given to him by his father for Little League 2 summers ago. He had stopped playing after 1 season, deciding skateboarding was more his style. The bat had sat unused in the garage ever since, until Kyle had picked it up and turned it into an instrument of destruction. No fingerprints on the handle. Kyle had been smart enough to wear gloves, but not smart enough to get rid of the gloves themselves, which were found stuffed in his bedroom closet. The house told investigators everything they needed to know about sequence and method, but it couldn't tell them why. That was the question that hung over the crime scene like a ghost. Why would a 14-year-old boy systematically end his entire family? There were no signs of a struggle in Kyle's room, no indication that he had been threatened or attacked first. His computer was still on, paused in the middle of a video game. His homework sat untouched on his desk. Everything in his space suggested normalcy, routine. A typical teenage evening interrupted only by his decision to commit mass murder. The contrast between his undisturbed room and the carnage in the rest of the house was chilling. He had done this and then returned to his own space as if nothing had happened. Blood evidence painted a clear picture. Kyle had waited until David came home, had attacked from behind, giving his father no chance to defend himself, had then moved through the house methodically, eliminating each family member in turn. The entire event had taken less than 15 minutes. 15 minutes to destroy 4 lives and shatter a community's sense of safety. Forensic psychologists would later analyze the efficiency of his actions. No hesitation, no mistakes, no indication that he had struggled with the decision or felt remorse during the act. This wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't an emotional explosion that spiraled out of control. It was calculated, deliberate, and that made it infinitely more terrifying. The crime scene photographs would become evidence in the trial that followed. Jurors would see them and struggle to reconcile the images with the young face of the defendant. How could someone so young create such horror? How could a child who had been raised in a loving home, given every advantage, turn into this? The photos couldn't answer those questions. They could only document the aftermath. The silence where laughter used to live. The emptiness where a family used to gather. The permanent stain on a quiet street where neighbors used to feel safe. The Anderson house would never be lived in again. It would sit empty for months before finally being demolished. Because some places hold too much darkness, some walls have seen too much evil, and no amount of cleaning can wash away the memory of what happened inside. Detective Sarah Morrison stood in the Anderson garage at 3 in the morning, staring at the baseball bat under harsh LED work lights. The forensics team had already photographed it from every angle, collected samples, and documented its position. But Sarah couldn't look away. This ordinary piece of sporting equipment had been transformed into something monstrous. She thought about Marcus getting it as a gift, probably excited at the time. Thought about how it had sat unused for years, waiting. Objects don't have destiny. People give them purpose. And Kyle had given this bat a purpose that would haunt everyone who saw it. The forensics team worked through the night, collecting evidence that would build an airtight case. Blood samples from each victim were cataloged and compared. Hair fibers were lifted from the bat and analyzed. Footprint patterns in the bloodstains told the story of Kyle's movements through the house. He had walked calmly from room to room, tracking his family's blood across the floors they had once cleaned together. The pattern showed no running, no panic, just steady, purposeful steps, like someone completing a checklist. The lead forensic analyst, Dr. Patricia Chen, had processed hundreds of crime scenes in her career. She told Sarah this was different. Most killers left evidence of chaos, rage, loss of control. This scene showed control, planning, intent. Kyle's clothing told its own story. The jeans and shirt he had been wearing when police arrived were clean. Too clean. No blood spatter, no defensive wounds on his hands. He had changed clothes after the murders, washing himself and putting on fresh items as if preparing for the police he knew would arrive. The bloody clothes were found in the washing machine, already through a complete cycle. He had added extra detergent, trying to eliminate evidence. But modern forensics can detect blood even after washing. Luminol testing revealed traces on the clothing that matched all 4 victims. The gloves he had worn were cottonwork gloves from the garage, David's gloves, still damp when investigators found them. Kyle had washed those too, but blood had soaked through the fabric and into the fibers where soap and water couldn't reach. The timeline reconstruction took 3 days of painstaking work. Security cameras from neighboring houses provided crucial information. At 6:15 in the evening, David's car pulled into the driveway. He was seen carrying a pizza box, walking to his front door with no awareness that these would be his final moments. At 6:17, a neighbor's camera caught movement in the Anderson living room window, a shape passing quickly. Then nothing. No one left the house. No one entered. At 7:42, the same neighbor who would later call police was captured on her own doorbell camera, stepping outside because she thought she heard screaming. She stood on her porch for several seconds, looking toward the Anderson house. Then she went back inside and called 911. Police arrived at 7:51. 36 minutes had passed between the murders and the call for help. Inside Kyle's room, investigators found evidence that suggested premeditation. His internet search history revealed disturbing queries from the weeks leading up to the murders. How long does it take to bleed out? Can security cameras see in the dark? What happens to juveniles who commit serious crimes? He had researched his own legal protection, understanding that his age might shield him from the harshest consequences. Most chilling was a search from 3 days before the murders, best way to disappear after crime. He had considered running, had thought about escape, but ultimately decided to stay, betting that the system would protect a child even from himself. That arrogance would become a defining feature of his case. His phone records revealed limited communication. Kyle had few friends and rarely texted. But there was one exchange that caught investigators' attention. 2 weeks before the murders, a classmate had messaged him asking if he was okay. Kyle's response was brief and cryptic. "Soon everything will be different." The classmate had replied with a simple cool, and the conversation ended there. When interviewed later, the classmate couldn't remember why they had reached out or what they thought Kyle meant. It seemed insignificant at the time, just another meaningless teenage exchange. But now, with hindsight, those words took on new meaning. Kyle had known what was coming, had been planning it, and had dropped hints that no one understood until it was too late. The physical evidence was overwhelming, but investigators wanted to understand the psychological component. Dr. Michael Ross, a forensic psychologist, was brought in to review the case materials and provide insight. After studying the crime scene photos, Kyle's background, and the interview footage, Dr. Ross delivered his preliminary assessment. Kyle exhibited traits consistent with antisocial personality disorder: lack of empathy, no remorse, superficial charm when it suited his purposes, manipulative behavior, an inflated sense of self-worth. But what troubled Dr. Ross most was Kyle's age. These traits typically don't fully manifest until late adolescence or early adulthood. Seeing them this developed in a 14-year-old suggested something deeply wrong had been present for years, possibly since early childhood. School records painted a picture that family and neighbors had missed. Kyle had been suspended twice in the past year, once for threatening another student in the cafeteria, telling him he knew where he lived and could make him disappear. Another time for drawing disturbing images in his notebook during class. Violent scenes with stick figures being harmed in various ways. When confronted, Kyle had claimed they were just drawings, nothing serious, and acted confused about why teachers were concerned. His grades had been declining steadily, not because he couldn't do the work, but because he didn't care to. Teachers noted that he seemed detached, going through the motions without any real engagement. One teacher wrote in a progress report from October, just weeks before the murders, "Kyle seems to be somewhere else mentally. I'm concerned, but he refuses to open up." Jennifer had known something was wrong. Her sister Rachel told investigators about phone calls where Jennifer expressed worry about Kyle's behavior. He was staying up all night, sleeping through the day, refusing to eat meals with the family. When Jennifer tried to talk to him, he shut down or became hostile. David had suggested counseling, and Jennifer had made an appointment for the following month. An appointment Kyle would never attend. The family had been trying to help him, had recognized that something wasn't right, but they had underestimated the severity, had thought they were dealing with typical teenage rebellion, had no idea they were living with someone capable of destroying them all. That appointment card was found on the refrigerator, held up by a magnet shaped like a butterfly. Emma's magnet. Jennifer had put it there, hopeful that help was coming. She died not knowing it was already too late. Dr. Michael Ross sat across from Kyle 3 days after the murders, a digital recorder between them capturing every word. The boy looked tired, but not distressed. His eyes moved around the small interview room with casual interest, as if cataloging details he might need later. Dr. Ross had interviewed countless defendants, including several juveniles accused of violent crimes. But Kyle was different. Most young offenders showed some emotional response when confronted with their actions: shame, anger, defensiveness. Kyle showed nothing but mild curiosity about why he was there. When Dr. Ross introduced himself and explained his role, Kyle simply nodded and said, "Okay, what do you want to know?" The interview began with basic questions. How was Kyle sleeping? Was he eating? Did he understand what was happening? Kyle answered each question with minimal words, offering no elaboration unless specifically pressed. Yes, he was sleeping fine. Yes, he was eating. Yes, he understood he was in trouble. Dr. Ross noted the emotional flatness in his voice, the way he discussed his situation as if it were happening to someone else. When asked how he felt about his family being gone, Kyle paused for the first time. His face remained neutral, but his eyes shifted slightly, a micro-expression that lasted less than a second. "I don't know," he finally said. "It's weird that they're not there anymore, but I guess it doesn't really change anything for me." Dr. Ross pushed deeper, trying to access any thread of emotional connection. He asked Kyle to describe his relationship with each family member. Kyle talked about his mother like someone describing a character in a book they had read once. She was nice. She cooked dinner. She worked at a school. There was no warmth in his words, no indication that he was talking about someone who had raised him. When asked about his father, Kyle became slightly more animated, but not in the way Dr. Ross expected. He complained that David had been on him constantly about grades and behavior, that his father didn't understand him, that the rules in the house were stupid. Kyle spoke about his father's death not as a loss but as the removal of an obstacle. Marcus and Emma received even less consideration. Kyle described his younger brother as annoying, someone who asked too many questions and wanted attention Kyle didn't want to give. He said Marcus had started avoiding him recently, which was whatever. When Dr. Ross asked about Emma, Kyle shrugged. She was just a little kid, always drawing pictures and leaving them on my door. I threw most of them away. Dr. Ross felt his stomach turn. This wasn't grief. This wasn't even denial. Kyle genuinely seemed to view his siblings as minor inconveniences rather than human beings he had grown up with. The capacity for connection that exists in most people simply wasn't present in Kyle. He had lived with his family for 14 years and had apparently formed no meaningful attachment to any of them. The turning point in the interview came when Dr. Ross asked a direct question. "Kyle, did you hurt your family?" The boy's expression didn't change. He looked at Dr. Ross for a long moment, as if calculating the best response. Then he smiled slightly. Not a happy smile, a knowing smile, the smile of someone who thinks they're smarter than everyone else in the room. "My lawyer says I shouldn't answer questions like that," Kyle said, "so I'm not going to." Dr. Ross noted the lack of denial. Most innocent people immediately and forcefully reject accusations. Kyle simply deflected, using legal advice as a shield while revealing nothing about his actual guilt or innocence. But that smile had told Dr. Ross everything he needed to know. Over the next week, Dr. Ross conducted 4 more sessions with Kyle, each revealing more about the boy's psychological landscape. Kyle had no friends, a fact he didn't seem bothered by. He said other kids were boring, and he preferred being alone. When asked what he did enjoy, Kyle mentioned video games, specifically ones that involved strategy and winning. He liked feeling superior to other players, liked knowing he was better than them. When Dr. Ross asked if he ever felt bad when he won, if he had empathy for the people he beat, Kyle looked genuinely confused by the question. "Why would I feel bad? The point is to win. If they lose, that's their problem." The psychological testing revealed what Dr. Ross had suspected. Kyle scored exceptionally high on measures of narcissism and callousness. He showed no capacity for guilt or shame. His moral reasoning was entirely self-centered. Something was right if it benefited him. Something was wrong if it caused him consequences he didn't like. The suffering of others simply didn't register as relevant. When presented with hypothetical scenarios designed to test empathy, Kyle consistently chose options that maximized his own benefit regardless of harm to others. In one scenario involving finding a lost wallet, Kyle said he would keep the money because the person who lost it was stupid for losing it. When told the wallet contained rent money for a family with children, Kyle's response was immediate. "Still not my problem." But what disturbed Dr. Ross most was Kyle's view of his future. When asked what he thought would happen to him, Kyle expressed confidence that he wouldn't face serious consequences. He was 14. The system protected kids. He would probably go to some juvenile facility for a while, maybe get therapy, and then eventually get out and start over. He had researched it. He knew the laws. He genuinely believed his age would save him from accountability. Dr. Ross recognized this as a catastrophic miscalculation on Kyle's part. The boy had murdered 4 people and showed no remorse. No judge would look at this case and see a child who could be rehabilitated. They would see a dangerous individual who needed to be separated from society. But Kyle couldn't see that. His narcissism wouldn't allow it. In his final report, Dr. Ross wrote a conclusion that would haunt him for years. Kyle Anderson represents a rare and deeply troubling case. He exhibits severe antisocial traits at an age when most individuals are still developing their moral framework. More concerning is the complete absence of empathy or emotional connection to others. Kyle views people as objects to be used or obstacles to be removed. He shows no capacity for genuine human attachment. While his age makes definitive diagnosis complicated, the evidence suggests he may be what previous generations would have called a psychopath. He lacks the fundamental emotional wiring that allows most humans to care about others. Treatment options are limited because he doesn't view himself as having a problem. In my professional opinion, Kyle Anderson poses a significant ongoing threat to any community he might be released into. His age is irrelevant to his danger level. The courthouse steps were packed with media on the first day of Kyle Anderson's trial. News vans lined the street, reporters practicing their opening segments, cameras trained on the entrance. This case had captured national attention. A 14-year-old accused of murdering his entire family. No clear motive, no remorse. The public was divided. Some argued he was just a child who needed help, not punishment. Others demanded justice for the 4 lives taken. Inside the courthouse, security had been tripled. Death threats had been made. Not against Kyle, but against his defense attorney, a woman named Patricia Winters, who had the unenviable job of defending the indefensible. Kyle entered the courtroom in a button-down shirt and khakis, clothing chosen by his legal team to make him look younger and more innocent. His hair had been cut short and neatly combed. Without the casual clothing and defiant posture from the interrogation room, he looked like any other middle school student. That was the point. The defense strategy was clear from the beginning. Emphasize his youth, argue that something had broken in him that could be fixed. Paint him as a victim of mental illness rather than a calculating killer. But as Kyle took his seat at the defense table, that strategy began to crumble. Because he smiled. A small, barely noticeable smile that the cameras caught perfectly. As if this were all a game, he was confident he would win. Judge Margaret Chen presided over the trial, a stern woman in her 60s who had built a reputation for fairness and no-nonsense courtroom management. She looked at Kyle as he sat down, her expression unreadable. The gallery behind him was filled with journalists, legal observers, and family friends of the victims. Rachel, Jennifer's sister, sat in the front row. Her eyes were red from weeks of crying, but her jaw was set with determination. She wanted to look at Kyle throughout the trial, wanted him to see at least one person who wouldn't let him forget what he had destroyed. But Kyle never turned around, never acknowledged the people behind him. He kept his eyes forward, occasionally whispering to his attorney, but otherwise appearing disconnected from the proceedings. The prosecution was led by District Attorney James Morrison, a veteran prosecutor who had handled hundreds of cases, but none quite like this. His opening statement was powerful and direct. He walked the jury through the evening of November 7th, describing each victim in detail. Jennifer, the devoted teacher and mother. David, the steady father who coached soccer and never missed a recital. Marcus, the shy boy who loved skateboarding. Emma, the 8-year-old who collected butterflies and believed in kindness. James's voice cracked slightly when he described Emma's room, the stuffed animals arranged on her bed, the homework she would never finish. Several jurors wiped their eyes, but Kyle's expression didn't change. He sat perfectly still, looking at James with what could only be described as boredom. Patricia Winters presented the defense's opening statement with visible discomfort. She was a good attorney, ethical and competent, but she had taken this case because someone had to. Everyone deserved legal representation, even people accused of terrible things. Her argument focused on Kyle's age and mental state. She told the jury that this was a deeply troubled child who had experienced a psychological break, that something had gone catastrophically wrong in his brain, that putting a 14-year-old in prison for life was not justice, it was vengeance. She asked the jury to remember that Kyle was still a child, still developing, still capable of change. It was a reasonable argument delivered professionally, but it felt hollow in the face of what Kyle had done. And Patricia knew it. The first week of trial consisted of testimony from first responders and forensic experts. Officer Daniel Hayes described entering the house and finding the bodies, his voice steady, but his hands gripping the witness stand tightly. Dr. Patricia Chen walked the jury through the physical evidence, explaining blood spatter patterns and the timeline of deaths. The jury saw photographs that made several of them look away. Kyle watched the same photographs without flinching. He leaned back in his chair at one point, stretching as if he were sitting through a long movie rather than his own murder trial. Judge Chen noticed and leaned forward. "Mr. Anderson, sit up straight and pay attention. This is your trial, not a waiting room." Kyle straightened up immediately, but the smirk returned. "Yes, Your Honor," he said. The tone was respectful, but something underneath it wasn't. Judge Chen's eyes narrowed. She had dealt with difficult defendants before, but Kyle's attitude was different. Most defendants showed fear or anger or desperation. Kyle showed nothing but casual confidence, as if he already knew how this would end and wasn't worried. That attitude would prove to be a fatal mistake, because juries notice everything, and a jury watching a teenager show no emotion while viewing photographs of his murdered family was not a jury likely to show mercy. The emotional apex of the first week came when Rachel took the stand. She described her sister Jennifer, fighting through tears to paint a picture of a woman who had devoted her life to helping children. She talked about taking Jennifer's kids to the park, about family barbecues, about the last conversation they had where Jennifer expressed worry about Kyle but never imagined he was dangerous. When the prosecutor asked Rachel how Jennifer's death had affected her, she broke down completely. "She was my best friend," Rachel sobbed. "My person. And she died trying to protect her children. She died not understanding why her own son would do this." The courtroom was silent except for Rachel's crying. Several jurors were in tears. Even Patricia Winters looked moved. But Kyle sat motionless, his face blank. Watching Rachel with the same detached interest he showed everything else. As Rachel stepped down from the witness stand, she passed within feet of Kyle. She stopped, turned, looked directly at him. "She loved you," Rachel said, her voice breaking. "All of them loved you, and you threw them away like garbage." Kyle met her eyes for the first time since the trial began. For a moment, everyone in the courtroom held their breath, waiting to see if he would show something. Anything. Remorse, anger, recognition. But Kyle simply stared back at Rachel with those flat, empty eyes. Then he shrugged. One small, dismissive movement that said everything about who he was. Judge Chen immediately ordered Kyle to face forward and warned him about courtroom behavior. But the damage was done. That shrug had been captured by courtroom artists and would be described in every news report that evening. The boy who shrugged at his aunt's grief. The teenager who couldn't even pretend to care. The second week of trial began with the evidence that would seal Kyle's fate. The prosecution had built their case methodically, piece by piece, creating a narrative so airtight that even the most skeptical juror couldn't deny what had happened. James Morrison stood before the jury with a large monitor behind him, ready to walk them through the digital evidence that painted a picture of premeditation and cold calculation. The first image that appeared was a screenshot from Kyle's search history. How to clean blood from clothes. The search had been made 3 weeks before the murders. Kyle had been planning this. thinking about logistics, preparing for what he intended to do. More searches followed, each one more damning than the last. Juvenile murder sentencing by state. Can minors get death penalty? Best lawyers for juvenile defendants. Kyle had researched not just how to commit his crime, but how to survive the aftermath. He had studied the legal system, understood his protections as a minor, and concluded that he could get away with something most people couldn't even imagine doing. James let each search sit on the screen for several seconds, allowing the jury to fully absorb the implications. This wasn't a moment of rage. This wasn't a child who snapped under pressure. This was a teenager who had carefully planned the destruction of his entire family and believed he was smart enough to escape serious consequences. The most chilling piece of digital evidence came from Kyle's computer files. Buried in a folder labeled Homework, investigators had found a document created 2 months before the murders. It was titled simply Plan. The contents were brief but explicit. A list of family members with notes beside each name. Dad, ambush when he comes home. Mom, kitchen, won't expect it. Marcus, bedroom door closed. Emma, last will be easy. Beneath the list was a single line that made several jurors gasp when it appeared on screen. Wednesday night, parents have meeting, good timing. Kyle had chosen the date, had picked a moment when his parents would be distracted and tired, had mapped out the sequence of deaths like someone planning a shopping trip. The document had been deleted, but digital forensics had recovered it from his hard drive where nothing ever truly disappears. Patricia Winters objected multiple times during the presentation of digital evidence, arguing that search history alone didn't prove intent and that the document could have been a dark fantasy rather than an actual plan. Judge Chen overruled each objection. The document existed. The searches existed. And 4 people were dead in exactly the manner described in that file. The connection was undeniable. Kyle watched his planning being exposed to the courtroom with the same blank expression he had maintained throughout the trial. If he felt concern about how badly this evidence damaged his case, he didn't show it. He leaned over to whisper something to Patricia, who shook her head firmly. Whatever he had suggested, she wasn't going to do it. The forensic evidence came next, presented with clinical precision by Dr. Patricia Chen. She explained to the jury how blood evidence had been matched to each victim using DNA analysis, how the baseball bat had been conclusively identified as the murder weapon based on blood, hair, and tissue samples, how Kyle's gloves, even after washing, contained microscopic traces that linked him directly to each family member's death. Dr. Chen showed the jury photographs of the gloves under high magnification, pointing out the fiber patterns where blood had soaked through. She explained that Kyle's attempt to clean the evidence had actually helped investigators because the specific detergent he used left chemical markers that proved he had washed items immediately after the crimes. The clothing evidence was equally damning. Kyle's original outfit from that evening had been found in the washing machine, but luminol testing revealed blood spatter patterns consistent with being present during violent attacks. The prosecution displayed photographs taken under UV light, showing the ghostly glow of blood evidence that normal washing couldn't remove. Dr. Chen walked the jury through each stain, explaining which victim it came from and what it revealed about Kyle's position during the attacks. He had been close, had stood over each victim as they died. The blood patterns showed no hesitation between strikes, just efficient repeated blows until movement stopped. One juror looked visibly ill and requested a break. Judge Chen called for a 15-minute recess. When court resumed, the prosecution presented their most powerful evidence, the video testimony. Kyle had been recorded during multiple police interviews, and the prosecution played edited segments that showed his evolution from fake confusion to calculated deflection. In the first interview, Kyle claimed to know nothing, said he had been in his room with headphones on, expressed shock that his family was gone. But his body language told a different story. No tears, no trembling, no signs of genuine grief. The jury watched him describe his family's deaths with less emotion than most people showed discussing a canceled appointment. Then the prosecution played his interview with Dr. Ross, specifically the moment when asked if he had hurt his family. That smile, that knowing, arrogant smile that said he thought he was smarter than everyone investigating him. The timeline reconstruction was presented through a detailed animation that showed Kyle's movements through the house. Based on blood evidence, forensics, and security camera timestamps, investigators had created a minute-by-minute recreation of the murders. The animation showed a figure representing Kyle waiting in the living room, David entering through the front door, the attack from behind, the figure moving to the kitchen where Jennifer tried to call for help, then upstairs to Marcus's room, finally to Emma's room at the end of the hall. The entire sequence took 14 minutes according to the evidence. 14 minutes to destroy 4 lives. The jury watched in stunned silence as the animation played on the large screen. Several jurors were crying openly by the end. Kyle watched the same. Animation without any visible reaction. Character witnesses provided the final pieces of the prosecution's case. Teachers testified about Kyle's threatening behavior at school. The student he had threatened in the cafeteria described how Kyle had cornered him and said, "I know where you live and how to make problems disappear." A former friend, one of the few Kyle had ever had, testified that Kyle had once told him he didn't understand why people cared about others, that it seemed like a waste of energy. The friend had thought Kyle was trying to sound edgy and philosophical. Now he realized Kyle had been telling the truth about how he viewed the world. Each witness added another layer to the portrait of someone fundamentally broken, someone missing the essential components that make us human. The prosecution's closing argument for the evidence phase was devastating in its simplicity. James Morrison stood before the jury and summarized what they had seen: premeditation proven by searches and planning documents, execution proven by forensic evidence and timeline reconstruction, lack of remorse proven by Kyle's own words and behavior. "The defense will ask you to see a troubled child," James said quietly. "I'm asking you to see the truth." Kyle Anderson knew exactly what he was doing. He planned it carefully. He executed his plan efficiently. And he has shown no indication that he regrets any of it. This is not a child who made a terrible mistake. This is a dangerous individual who committed calculated murder and expected his age to protect him from consequences. Don't let it. The jury listened intently, many of them nodding slightly. The evidence had done its work. Now all that remained was the verdict and the sentence that would follow. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. In the courthouse hallway, Rachel paced back and forth, unable to sit still. She had watched every moment of the trial, seen every piece of evidence, heard every testimony. But now, in the waiting, doubt crept in. What if they saw Kyle as just a child? What if sympathy for his age outweighed the horror of what he had done? Patricia Winters sat alone on a bench outside the courtroom, reviewing her notes even though there was nothing left to review. She had done her job, had argued for mercy based on Kyle's youth and mental state. But even she wasn't sure she wanted to win. Some cases haunted you regardless of the outcome. This was one of them. When the bailiff announced the jury had reached a verdict, the courtroom filled quickly. Kyle was brought in wearing the same neutral expression he had maintained throughout the trial. He took his seat next to Patricia, who leaned over to whisper something to him. He nodded, but said nothing. The jury filed in, none of them looking at the defense table. That was a bad sign for Kyle, though he didn't seem to notice or care. Judge Chen asked if the jury had reached a verdict. The forewoman, a middle-aged teacher who had cried during Rachel's testimony, stood and confirmed they had. The courtroom went silent except for the sound of breathing and the hum of the ventilation system. On the count of murder in the first degree of David Anderson, how do you find? Judge Chen's voice was steady and clear. The forewoman looked down at the paper in her hand. Guilty. Rachel let out a small sob. The forewoman continued. On the count of murder in the first degree of Jennifer Anderson, guilty. On the count of murder in the first degree of Marcus Anderson, guilty. On the count of murder in the first degree of Emma Anderson, guilty. 4 guilty verdicts. 4 lives acknowledged. 4 counts of justice declared. Kyle's expression flickered for just a moment. Not sadness, not fear, irritation. As if the jury had gotten something wrong and he was annoyed by their stupidity. Patricia put her hand on his arm, perhaps offering comfort, perhaps warning him to control his reaction. The sentencing phase began 2 weeks later. This was where Kyle's age would matter most. The prosecution argued for life without the possibility of parole, the harshest sentence available for a juvenile. James Morrison presented evidence of Kyle's danger to society, the psychological evaluations, the complete lack of remorse, the calculated nature of the crimes. He argued that some people, regardless of age, were simply too dangerous to ever release. The defense countered with experts who testified about brain development in teenagers, how the prefrontal cortex, responsible for decision-making and impulse control, wasn't fully formed until the mid-20s. They argued that Kyle could change, could be rehabilitated, could eventually become someone safe to release. It was a battle between science and reality, between hope and evidence. Judge Chen took 3 days to make her decision. During that time, she reviewed every piece of evidence again. Read Dr. Ross's psychological evaluation multiple times. Studied cases of other juvenile offenders who had been given life sentences. She understood the weight of what she was about to do. Sentencing a 14-year-old to die in prison was not a decision any judge made lightly. But she also understood that her job was to protect society and deliver justice for the victims. On the morning of sentencing, the courtroom was even more packed than it had been for the verdict. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the moment that would define how society viewed juvenile justice and personal responsibility. Kyle was brought in wearing the same button-down shirt from the trial. He had grown slightly in the weeks since the verdict, his face looking a bit older, or maybe that was just the lighting. Judge Chen waited until everyone was seated and the room was completely silent. She looked at Kyle for a long moment, as if searching for something in his face, some sign of humanity, some indication that the gravity of this moment was reaching him. Kyle looked back at her with the same flat, empty stare he had given everyone throughout the trial. Judge Chen took a breath and began to speak. Her voice was calm, but carried the weight of what she was about to say. Kyle Anderson, you have been found guilty of 4 counts of murder in the first degree. These were not crimes of passion or accidents born of negligence. You planned the deaths of your family members. You executed that plan with precision, and you have shown no remorse for your actions. Judge Chen paused, looking down at her notes. I have reviewed extensive evidence about your mental state. I have read expert testimony about juvenile brain development. I have considered arguments that you deserve a chance at rehabilitation due to your age. But I have also considered the 4 people who will never get a second chance. Jennifer Anderson will never teach another student. David Anderson will never coach another soccer game. Marcus will never land another skateboard trick. And Emma will never grow up to see what she might have become. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the journalists had stopped typing, waiting for the words that would seal Kyle's fate. Judge Chen continued. The law recognizes that juveniles are different from adults, that they are still developing, that they deserve opportunities for redemption. But the law also recognizes that some crimes are so heinous, so calculated, and committed by individuals so dangerous that public safety must take precedence over rehabilitation potential. You are 14 years old. In many ways, you are still a child. But you are also a child who methodically murdered 4 people and has demonstrated no capacity for empathy or remorse. Every expert who has evaluated you has concluded that you pose a significant ongoing danger to society. Judge Chen looked directly at Kyle, her expression hardening. You made choices that night. You chose to plan these murders. You chose to carry them out. You chose to show no mercy to people who loved you. And now I must choose how to respond. This court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole on each count of murder, to be served consecutively. You will spend the rest of your natural life in custody. You will never be released. You will grow old and die behind bars, just as your family died in their home. The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond this courtroom. Kyle's expression finally changed. His eyes widened slightly. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. For the first time, he seemed to understand that his age hadn't protected him, that his calculations had been wrong, that he had destroyed his own life along with his family's. Rachel sobbed openly in the gallery, but they were tears of relief mixed with grief. Justice had been served, but it didn't bring her sister back, didn't return the life that Emma would never live or the games Marcus would never play. The sentence was right. She knew that, but it felt hollow anyway, because no punishment could truly balance the scales, no sentence could undo what had been done. Patricia Winters put her hand on Kyle's shoulder as deputies moved forward to take him away. He shook his head slowly, as if refusing to accept what had just happened, as if his belief in his own specialness, his own protection, was finally cracking. The deputies put handcuffs on him and began leading him toward the door that would take him to begin his life sentence. As Kyle reached the courtroom door, he turned back one last time. His eyes scanned the room, perhaps looking for sympathy or understanding. He found neither. The faces looking back at him reflected anger, satisfaction, and sadness, but not sympathy. Never sympathy. Because sympathy is reserved for people who show some capacity for recognizing their own wrongs. Kyle had shown none of that. Even now, being led away to spend the rest of his life in prison, he seemed more confused than regretful, more surprised that consequences had found him than sorry for what he had done. The door closed behind him with a heavy metallic sound, and just like that, Kyle Anderson disappeared from the free world forever. The gavel had fallen. Justice had been delivered. And a community could begin the long, painful process of trying to heal. The Anderson house stood empty for months after the trial, a monument to tragedy that no one wanted to acknowledge. The for sale sign in the yard remained untouched, dirt and rain slowly wearing away the cheerful lettering. Neighbors avoided looking at it when they drove past, as if ignoring the structure might erase the memories of what had happened inside. Children who used to ride their bikes freely on Maple Drive now stayed on the opposite side of the street, sensing without understanding that something terrible lived in that space. The grass grew wild, the gutters filled with leaves. Nature slowly reclaimed a house that humans had abandoned to horror. Eventually, the property would be sold to a demolition company for half its value. Some places are too broken to fix. Rachel couldn't sleep anymore, not really. She managed a few hours each night, interrupted by dreams where she arrived at Jennifer's house 5 minutes earlier, in time to stop everything. In these dreams, she walked through the door and found her sister cooking dinner, the children doing homework, everything normal and safe. But then she would see Kyle standing in the corner, and she would wake up gasping, her heart racing, knowing she couldn't change the past, no matter how many times her sleeping mind tried to rewrite it. She had taken a leave of absence from her job as a nurse, couldn't focus, couldn't handle other people's emergencies when her own grief felt like drowning. Therapy helped, but only slightly. How do you process the murder of your entire family by someone who should have loved them? The community of Maple Drive held a memorial service 6 weeks. After the sentencing, more than 300 people attended, filling the local community center beyond capacity. Photographs of Jennifer, David, Marcus, and Emma were displayed on easels at the front of the room, smiling faces frozen in moments when they were happy and alive and had no idea what was coming. Jennifer's students made a banner with handwritten messages. "You made me love reading. You always believed in me. I miss your smile." Marcus's soccer team wore their jerseys in his honor. Emma's dance class performed a piece dedicated to her memory, tiny girls in butterfly costumes moving across the stage while parents wept in the audience. David's co-workers spoke about his reliability and kindness. The memorial celebrated 4 lives while trying not to focus on how those lives had ended. But the shadow of Kyle hung over everything. No one wanted to say his name, but everyone was thinking about him. How could they not? The memorial was necessary because of what he had done. The grief that filled the room existed because a 14-year-old boy had decided his family didn't deserve to live. Speaker after speaker tried to make sense of the senseless, to find meaning in tragedy, to believe that something good could come from something so horrible. But the truth was simpler and darker. Sometimes evil existed without explanation. Sometimes people were broken in ways that couldn't be fixed. And sometimes the only response was to acknowledge the damage and try to prevent it from spreading further. The memorial ended with a moment of silence that felt heavier than any words could have been. The psychological impact rippled outward beyond the immediate community. Parents across the country read about the case and looked at their own teenagers with new fear. What signs had the Andersons missed? What warning signals should other parents watch for? Schools implemented new threat assessment protocols. Therapists reported increased appointments from parents worried about their children's behavior. The case had touched a nerve in American culture, forcing people to confront uncomfortable questions about juvenile violence and family dynamics. If this could happen to the Andersons, a seemingly normal family in a safe neighborhood, where else could it happen? The answer, of course, was anywhere. And that realization kept people awake at night. Mental health professionals studied the case intensely, searching for patterns that might predict future tragedies. Dr. Ross published a paper analyzing Kyle's psychological profile and comparing it to other juvenile offenders. He identified several markers that had been present in Kyle's behavior for years. Cruelty to animals as a young child, though his parents had dismissed it as curiosity. Lack of close friendships despite having social opportunities. A pattern of lying without apparent purpose or benefit. Fascination with violence in media that went beyond normal interest. Inability to accept responsibility when confronted with wrongdoing. These markers alone didn't predict violence, but in combination, they suggested something deeply wrong. The paper concluded with a frustrating truth. Even when warning signs exist, intervention is difficult because most people exhibiting these traits never commit serious crimes. The victim's extended family struggled in different ways. Jennifer's mother, Kyle's grandmother, suffered a breakdown that required hospitalization. She had lost her daughter and 3 grandchildren, but perhaps worse, she blamed herself for not seeing what Kyle was. She had noticed he was different as a child, had mentioned to Jennifer that something seemed off about him. But Jennifer had defended her son, insisted he was just shy or going through phases. Now, Kyle's grandmother was haunted by the question of what she could have done differently. Should she have insisted on evaluation? Should she have been more forceful in her concerns? The rational part of her mind knew she wasn't responsible for Kyle's choices. But grief isn't rational. It searches for someone to blame. And when the actual perpetrator is already behind bars, it often turns inward. David's brother Michael took a different approach to his grief. He became an advocate for victims' rights, speaking at conferences and lobbying for stronger laws around juvenile sentencing. He argued that age alone shouldn't determine punishment, that the nature of the crime and the individual's capacity for rehabilitation should matter more. Some people criticized him, saying he was using tragedy to push an agenda. But Michael didn't care. He needed to turn his rage and sorrow into something productive, needed to believe that his brother's death might prevent future tragedies. He testified before legislative committees, wrote opinion pieces for newspapers, appeared on news programs to discuss the case. If he stopped moving, stopped fighting, he would have to sit with the full weight of his loss. And he wasn't ready for that yet. Maybe he never would be. The first responders who had entered the Anderson house that night carried their own trauma. Officer Daniel Hayes left the police force 6 months after the murders. He couldn't shake the images from that scene, couldn't separate his work from the horror he had witnessed. He tried therapy and medication, but ultimately decided he needed a complete change. He moved to a different state and took a job in construction, working with his hands instead of confronting humanity's worst moments. His wife told friends that Daniel was different after that night, quieter, more withdrawn. The Daniel who had been excited about police work and helping people had disappeared somewhere in that blood-stained house. The Daniel who returned was someone else entirely. Trauma changes people, sometimes permanently. The community eventually began to heal, though the scars remained visible. New families moved on to Maple Drive, unaware of the history or choosing to ignore it. The lot where the Anderson house once stood was eventually sold, and a new structure built, modern and sleek and bearing no resemblance to what had been there before. But the older residents remembered. They would always remember. Some trauma becomes part of a place's identity, woven into its story in ways that can never be fully erased. Children who grew up on Maple Drive during that time would tell their own children about it someday. The story would become legend, then myth, distorted by time but never forgotten. Because some events are too significant to fade away. They become warnings, reminders, evidence that evil can exist anywhere, even in places that seem safe, even in families that seem normal, even in children who should be innocent. Kyle's first months in the juvenile detention facility were an adjustment he hadn't anticipated. He had expected some kind of special treatment, assumed that his intelligence and youth would grant him privileges, or at least respect from other inmates. He was wrong. The facility housed other juveniles convicted of serious crimes, and they had their own hierarchy. A hierarchy where someone who killed their entire family occupied a special place, not at the top, at the bottom. Even among criminals, even among kids who had done terrible things, there were lines. Kyle had crossed all of them. The other inmates avoided him. Guards watched him with undisguised contempt. He was isolated in ways that his narcissism prevented him from fully understanding. His cell was small and sterile. A bed bolted to the wall, a metal toilet and sink combination, a small desk where he could write or read if he chose to. The walls were cinder block painted institutional beige, the kind of color that seemed designed to prevent any emotional response whatsoever. Kyle spent hours staring at those walls, perhaps waiting for regret to arrive, perhaps just passing time. A psychiatrist who evaluated him 3 months into his incarceration noted that Kyle showed no signs of depression or anxiety despite his circumstances. He wasn't happy, but he wasn't particularly unhappy either. He existed in a strange emotional flatland where even imprisonment couldn't generate strong feelings. The psychiatrist found this more disturbing than if Kyle had been falling apart. At least emotional collapse would indicate some recognition of what he had lost. During mandated therapy sessions, Kyle remained guarded and dismissive. His therapist, Dr. Linda Martinez, had worked with violent offenders for 15 years. She had seen remorse, denial, anger, and every variation in between. But Kyle presented something different. He attended sessions because he was required to, sat in the chair across from her, and answered questions with minimal engagement. When Dr. Martinez asked how he felt about his family's deaths, Kyle gave the same response he had given Dr. Ross. "It's weird that they're not there, but I don't know what you want me to say." She's pushed him to explore that statement. What was weird about it? Did he miss them? Did he think about them? Kyle shrugged. "Sometimes I think about things being different, but it doesn't really matter now." Dr. Martinez tried various therapeutic approaches, searching for any emotional entry point. She asked Kyle to write letters to his family members, an exercise designed to access feelings he might not be able to verbalize. Kyle wrote 4 letters in one session, each barely a paragraph long. The letter to his mother mentioned that she made good tacos. The letter to his father acknowledged that David had taught him to ride a bike. The letters to Marcus and Emma were even shorter, noting that they existed and sometimes annoyed him. There was no apology, no expression of loss, no indication that he viewed them as real people rather than characters in a story he had grown tired of. Dr. Martinez read the letters and felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't suppressed emotion waiting to emerge. This was genuine emptiness. Kyle truly didn't feel what other people felt. The most revealing moment came during a session 4 months into his incarceration. Dr. Martinez asked Kyle if he ever thought about what his life would have been like if he hadn't committed the murders. She expected deflection or a refusal to engage with the hypothetical. Instead, Kyle considered the question seriously. "I think about it sometimes," he said slowly. "I'd probably still be in school, still have to follow stupid rules. My parents would still be on me about grades and behavior. Marcus would still be annoying. Emma would still leave her drawings everywhere." He paused, his expression thoughtful. "Honestly, this isn't that different. I still have rules and people telling me what to do, but at least here, I don't have to pretend to care about them." Dr. Martinez struggled to maintain her professional composure. Kyle had just equated family life with prison and concluded they were roughly equivalent. He had no concept of what he had lost because he had never valued it in the first place. Other inmates began to understand that something was fundamentally wrong with Kyle beyond the crime he had committed. During recreation time, when juveniles were allowed limited social interaction, most gave him a wide berth. But one inmate, a 17-year-old named Marcus, who was serving time for armed robbery, decided to confront Kyle. He cornered him in the common area and demanded to know why he had killed his family. Kyle looked at Marcus with that same flat stare and said simply, "They were in my way." Marcus, who had his own complicated family history and despite his crimes still loved his mother, felt rage rise in his chest. He shoved Kyle against the wall and guards immediately intervened. But the interaction revealed something important. Even in a facility full of criminals, Kyle's complete lack of humanity set him apart. He wasn't just dangerous, he was incomprehensible. Kyle's intelligence worked against him in prison. He was smart enough to understand that he was supposed to show remorse, supposed to express regret, supposed to demonstrate growth and change. He knew what people wanted to hear, but he couldn't bring himself to fake it consistently. His narcissism prevented him from believing he needed to play by rules designed for lesser people. During a parole evaluation that wouldn't matter for decades but was required by law, Kyle told the evaluator exactly what he thought. "Everyone acts like what I did was so terrible, but people die every day. My family died. That's just what happened. I don't see why I'm supposed to spend my whole life being sorry about something I can't change." The evaluator noted that Kyle showed no insight into his actions and recommended he remain classified as high risk indefinitely. Letters from the outside world arrived occasionally. Most were from anti-death penalty activists or criminal justice reform advocates who believed Kyle represented everything wrong with the system. They argued he was a child who deserved rehabilitation, not life imprisonment. Kyle read these letters with detached interest. He didn't particularly care about their arguments, but he appreciated that someone thought he mattered. He wrote back to a few of them, carefully crafting responses that suggested confusion and pain. He told them he didn't understand what had happened to him that night, that something had broken inside him, that he wished he could take it back. These letters were lies, strategic attempts to build support for a future appeal. But they revealed something true about Kyle. He was capable of manipulation when motivated. He just wasn't motivated most of the time because he didn't care enough about outcomes to put in the effort. As months turned into years, Kyle settled into a routine: wake up, eat meals, attend mandatory education classes, sit through therapy, exercise, sleep, repeat. His life had become a predictable cycle with no variation and no end in sight. Most people would find this existence unbearable. The lack of freedom, the constant surveillance, the knowledge that this was forever. But Kyle adapted with unsettling ease. He didn't need much from life, didn't crave connection or experience or growth. He existed, and existence was enough. Dr. Martinez noted in one evaluation that Kyle seemed almost content in prison. Not happy, but not suffering either. He had everything he apparently needed: food, shelter, and no expectations of emotional connection. In some ways, prison was perfect for someone like Kyle. It removed all the social demands he had found tiresome. It freed him from having to pretend to be human. And in that freedom, Kyle revealed the truth. He didn't see himself as a person who had lost everything. He saw himself as someone who had finally escaped the burden of having to care about anyone at all. The Kyle Anderson case ignited a national debate that dominated news cycles for months. Legal scholars appeared on television programs to discuss juvenile sentencing, arguing passionately on both sides. Some insisted that life without parole for a 14-year-old violated the constitutional prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. They cited brain science showing that adolescent minds were still developing, that impulse control and decision-making capacities weren't fully formed until the mid-20s. They argued that sentencing a child to die in prison abandoned any hope of rehabilitation and contradicted everything research showed about human development. These advocates painted Kyle as a victim of a system that had given up on him before he had a chance to grow and change. Others disagreed vehemently. Victims' rights advocates pointed to the 4 people who would never get a chance to grow older. They argued that some crimes were so heinous that age became irrelevant, that Kyle had demonstrated planning and calculation that went beyond typical juvenile impulsivity, that his complete lack of remorse suggested he was fundamentally different from most young offenders who showed genuine regret. These voices dominated talk radio and opinion sections of newspapers. They represented families who had lost loved ones to violence and felt that the justice system too often prioritized perpetrators over victims. For them, Kyle's sentence wasn't excessive. It was appropriate recognition of the magnitude of his crimes. Online forums exploded with commentary from people who had never met Kyle but felt qualified to judge his case. Anonymous users typed thousands of words arguing whether he deserved a second chance or should have received something even harsher. Some suggested he was a psychopath who would never change. Others insisted that with proper treatment and time, any person could be rehabilitated. The debate revealed deep divisions in how Americans viewed crime and punishment. Progressive voices emphasized redemption and the failures of the prison system. Conservative voices emphasized accountability and the need to protect society from dangerous individuals. And in the middle were people who simply didn't know what to think about a 14-year-old who had murdered his entire family without apparent reason. Law schools across the country added the Anderson case to their criminal law curricula. Professors used it to discuss the intersection of juvenile justice, mental health, and public safety. Students debated whether Judge Chen had ruled correctly or whether the sentence was too harsh. Some argued that life without parole should never apply to juveniles regardless of crime. Others contended that certain individuals posed such a threat that release could never be considered. Mock trials were held with students taking on the roles of prosecution and defense. These exercises revealed how personal values shaped legal interpretation. Two students could look at the same facts and reach opposite conclusions based on whether they prioritized rehabilitation or retribution. The case became a mirror reflecting each person's fundamental beliefs about human nature and justice. The Supreme Court had previously ruled on juvenile sentencing in several landmark cases. In 2005, they had abolished the death penalty for crimes committed by juveniles. In 2010, they had eliminated life without parole for non-homicide offenses by juveniles. These rulings established that children were constitutionally different from adults and deserved special consideration in sentencing. But they had stopped short of eliminating life without parole entirely for juvenile offenders. The Anderson case prompted renewed calls for the court to revisit the issue. Advocacy groups filed amicus briefs arguing that the sentence violated evolving standards of decency. They pointed to international law, where most developed nations prohibited life sentences for juveniles. They argued that America stood alone in its willingness to give up on children. But the court declined to hear Kyle's appeal. The justices issued no written opinion, simply denying certiorari without comment. Legal analysts speculated about why. Perhaps the facts of the case were too extreme. Perhaps the calculated nature of the murders and Kyle's complete lack of remorse made him a poor candidate for establishing broader protections. Or perhaps the court simply believed that Judge Chen had ruled appropriately given the specific circumstances. Whatever the reason, the denial meant Kyle's sentence would stand. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The legal battle was over, but the philosophical debate continued. Conferences were held. Papers were published. Professors argued with each other in academic journals about whether society had failed Kyle or whether Kyle had simply been born without the capacity for empathy that makes civilization possible. Public opinion polls showed deep divisions along demographic lines. Younger respondents were more likely to support rehabilitation and oppose life sentences for juveniles. Older respondents tended to support harsh punishment for violent crimes regardless of offender age. Geographic location mattered too. Urban areas with higher crime rates showed more support for tough sentencing. Rural areas with close-knit communities expressed horror that a child could destroy his family and favored permanent removal from society. Political affiliation was predictive. Liberals emphasized systemic failures and the potential for change. Conservatives emphasized personal responsibility and the need to protect innocent people. The case became a proxy for larger disagreements about criminal justice, with Kyle serving as a symbol for whatever position someone already held. Media coverage evolved over time. Initial reporting focused on the shocking nature of the crime, a 14-year-old who murdered his family. The trial and sentencing dominated headlines, but as months passed, longer pieces emerged that tried to understand the broader implications. Magazine articles profiled Kyle's background, searching for explanations. They interviewed neighbors, teachers, and former friends. They analyzed his childhood for trauma that might explain his actions. But they found little. No abuse, no neglect, no obvious trigger. Kyle had been born into a normal family and had become a killer anyway. This made people uncomfortable because it suggested that evil could emerge without cause, that some people were simply broken in ways society couldn't prevent or fix. Documentary filmmakers approached Rachel about participating in a film about the case. She declined. She didn't want her sister's murder turned into entertainment, didn't want talking heads analyzing her family's tragedy for viewers who would watch and then move on to the next shocking story. But a documentary was made anyway, using public records and interviews with legal experts. It was titled Born to Kill, with a question mark that supposedly indicated journalistic objectivity, but really just drove viewership through sensationalism. The film presented both sides of the juvenile sentencing debate while lingering on crime scene photos and courtroom footage of Kyle's blank expression. It won awards at film festivals. Critics praised its balanced approach. Rachel never watched it. She knew her sister's life had been reduced to a cautionary tale, a data point in someone else's argument, and that reduction hurt almost as much as the loss itself. The story went viral in ways that surprised even seasoned journalists. Within hours of the sentencing, Kyle Anderson's name was trending on every social media platform. Clips from the trial circulated endlessly, the moment he shrugged at his aunt. The blank expression as guilty verdicts were read, the slight widening of his eyes when Judge Chen announced life without parole. These seconds of footage were replayed millions of times, analyzed frame by frame by amateur psychologists who claimed they could see evil in his face. True crime podcasts devoted entire episodes to the case. YouTubers created content dissecting every detail. The Anderson family tragedy became content, fuel for an industry built on society's fascination with violence and justice. Television news programs competed for exclusive angles. One network secured an interview with Kyle's former guidance counselor, who spoke about warning signs she wished she had recognized. Another found the classmate Kyle had threatened in the cafeteria, now a high school senior, who described feeling vindicated that people finally believed him when he said Kyle was dangerous. A third network tracked down Kyle's maternal grandmother, filming her tearful statement outside her home. She said she prayed for her daughter's soul and couldn't reconcile the smiling baby she remembered with the monster he had become. Each interview was promoted heavily, packaged with dramatic music and somber narration. The tragedy was being monetized, transformed from human suffering into ratings and revenue. Tabloids took the sensationalism further. Headlines screamed about the baby-faced killer and the teen terror. They published childhood photos of Kyle next to crime scene images, the contrast designed to maximize shock value. One particularly tasteless magazine ran a cover story titled Evil at 14, with Kyle's school photo altered to make his eyes look darker and more menacing. Rachel saw that cover at a grocery store checkout line and had to leave her cart and walk out. She sat in her car crying for 20 minutes, overwhelmed by how her sister's murder had become entertainment, how her niece and nephew's deaths were being used to sell magazines to people who would glance at the story while waiting in line and then forget about it by the time they got home. Social media influencers in the true crime community created content analyzing Kyle's psychology. They filmed videos in front of ring lights, speaking earnestly about narcissism and antisocial personality disorder. Some of them got details wrong, conflating facts from different cases or speculating wildly without evidence. But accuracy wasn't the point. Engagement was. Shocking claims generated comments and shares. One influencer suggested Kyle had been possessed by evil spirits. Another claimed to have insider information that the family had been involved in a cult. These theories spread despite being completely fabricated. Because the truth, that sometimes people are simply broken without explanation, wasn't satisfying enough. People wanted a story that made sense, that provided clear cause and effect, that reassured them this couldn't happen to their family because they would never join a cult or invite evil spirits into their home. News outlets debated the ethics of showing Kyle's face. He was a juvenile when the crimes occurred. Some argued that publishing his photo violated principles of juvenile justice that emphasized rehabilitation and privacy. Others contended that the severity of the crimes and his life sentence made him effectively an adult in the eyes of the law. Media organizations made different choices. Some pixelated his face in early coverage, but showed it clearly after sentencing. Others never showed it at all, describing him instead. But the most widely circulated images came from courtroom sketch artists who captured his expressions with disturbing accuracy. These drawings appeared everywhere, often more impactful than photographs because they emphasized his youth and his complete emotional disconnection. The case attracted international attention. News organizations from Europe, Asia, and Australia covered the story, often using it as evidence of America's uniquely punitive approach to juvenile crime. British newspapers contrasted Kyle's sentence with how he would have been treated in the UK, where life without parole for juveniles was prohibited. Scandinavian journalists wrote about their country's rehabilitative prison systems and suggested that Kyle represented the failure of America's retributive model. These pieces frustrated American readers who felt their country was being unfairly criticized. Online arguments erupted between people from different nations, debating whose justice system was superior. Kyle's case became a symbol in debates that had nothing to do with him personally and everything to do with cultural differences in how societies responded to crime. Expert commentators became fixtures on news programs. Dr. Ross was interviewed dozens of times, asked to explain Kyle's psychological profile to audiences hungry for understanding. He walked a careful line, providing clinical information without sensationalizing or reducing Kyle to a simple diagnosis. Other experts were less restrained. Some spoke confidently about Kyle's motivations despite never having evaluated him. They offered definitive statements about what he was thinking or feeling based on nothing but speculation. These talking heads filled airtime with authoritative-sounding analysis that often contradicted each other. One expert would claim Kyle was a psychopath incapable of change. Another would insist he was a traumatized child lashing out. Viewers heard conflicting information and formed opinions based on which expert's narrative aligned with their existing beliefs. The victims were sometimes lost in the media frenzy. Stories focused so heavily on Kyle that Jennifer, David, Marcus, and Emma became secondary characters in their own tragedy. Rachel noticed this shift, and it enraged her. She gave one interview to a local news station where she insisted on talking only about her sister and the children. She described Jennifer's dedication to teaching, David's quiet reliability, Marcus's shy kindness, and Emma's boundless empathy. She demanded that viewers remember these were real people with hopes and dreams and futures that were stolen. The interview was powerful and heartfelt. It was viewed a few thousand times. Meanwhile, A video analyzing Kyle's courtroom smirk had been viewed 15 million times. The disparity said everything about what captured public attention. People were more interested in the monster than the victims he created. Some media coverage tried to address larger systemic questions. Investigative journalists examined gaps in mental health services for juveniles. They reported on schools that lacked resources to identify and help troubled students. They explored how warning signs often went unnoticed because systems were overwhelmed and underfunded. These pieces were important and well-researched. They asked meaningful questions about prevention and intervention. But they didn't go viral. They didn't generate the clicks and shares that sensational coverage did. The thoughtful analysis that might actually contribute to preventing future tragedies was buried under an avalanche of content focused on shock, value, and speculation. The media frenzy around Kyle's case was loud and constant, and largely empty of anything useful. As months passed and new tragedies emerged, coverage of Kyle's case diminished. News cycles moved on. The constant updates stopped. Podcasts concluded their series and moved to other cases. Social media influencers found new subjects to analyze. Kyle Anderson became old news, filed away in the vast catalog of American violence. But for Rachel and the others who had loved the victims, the media frenzy left lasting damage. They had watched their private grief become public spectacle, had seen their loved ones reduced to plot points in other people's stories, had endured strangers with opinions about things they didn't understand and suffering they had never experienced. The cameras eventually went away. The journalists moved on. But the trauma of having your worst moment broadcast and analyzed and commodified never fully healed. It just became another layer of pain stacked on top of the original loss. Years passed slowly behind bars. Kyle turned 15, then 16, then 17. His body changed as adolescence continued its work, adding height and muscle mass despite the limited diet and exercise options. His face lost some of its childish softness, becoming more angular and defined. But his eyes remained the same, flat, empty, untroubled by the passage of time or the weight of what he had done. He was transferred to an adult facility when he turned 18, a maximum security prison where juvenile offenders with life sentences eventually ended up. The transition was jarring for most young inmates. The violence was more severe, the isolation more complete, the guards less interested in rehabilitation. But Kyle adapted with the same unsettling ease he had shown throughout his incarceration. His cell in the adult facility was slightly larger than his juvenile detention room, but just as sterile. Concrete walls, a narrow window too high to see out of properly, a metal bed bolted to the floor. He was allowed 1 hour of recreation per day in a small yard surrounded by high walls topped with razor wire. During that hour, he walked the perimeter alone. Other inmates avoided him. Word had spread about what he had done. In prison hierarchy, certain crimes marked you. Crimes against children, crimes against family. Kyle had committed both. Even hardened criminals who had done terrible things themselves viewed him with disgust. He existed in social exile, spoken to only when necessary, included in nothing voluntary. Letters from the outside arrived less frequently now. The activists who had championed his case in the early years had mostly moved on to other causes. Occasionally, someone would write asking for an interview or offering religious salvation. Kyle rarely responded. He had tried manipulation in the beginning, crafting letters that suggested growth and remorse. But the effort required more sustained interest than he could maintain. His narcissism made him believe he was smarter than everyone else. but his apathy prevented him from caring enough to consistently play the role of reformed criminal. So he stopped trying. He read books from the prison library, mostly science fiction and fantasy, where the rules of reality didn't apply. He watched television during designated hours, preferring game shows where winning was clear and objective. Dr. Martinez continued to see Kyle for mandated sessions even after his transfer to adult prison. She had followed his case longer than any other mental health professional, developing a clinical fascination with his complete lack of emotional development. Most offenders showed some change over time. They matured. They developed insight. They found religion or education, or simply aged into less volatile versions of themselves. Kyle remained remarkably consistent. At 19, he exhibited the same emotional emptiness he had shown at 14. She asked him once if he ever thought about his family. He considered the question as if it were a math problem requiring calculation. "Sometimes when I'm bored," he said, "but thinking about them doesn't change anything. They're gone and I'm here. That's just reality." Isolation became Kyle's permanent state. He had no friends, no meaningful connections, no one who cared whether he lived or died beyond professional obligations. Most people would find this unbearable. Humans are social creatures wired for connection. Solitary confinement is considered torture for a reason. But Kyle didn't seem to suffer from his isolation. He didn't crave companionship or emotional bonds, didn't feel the gnawing loneliness that drove other inmates to desperate acts for attention. He existed in his own universe, where other people were irrelevant scenery rather than real beings with internal lives. In some ways, prison had given him exactly what he wanted. Freedom from having to pretend to care. Permission to be completely alone without social expectations or obligations. The realization of his situation hit Kyle gradually over his late teens and early 20s. Not remorse, not regret, but a dawning understanding that this was forever, that he would never leave these walls, never have a career or family or experiences beyond what prison offered, never control his own schedule or choose his own meals or make decisions about his own life. Other inmates talked about their release dates, counting down years or decades until freedom. Kyle had no countdown. He had infinity. The weight of that truth settled on him not as crushing grief, but as dull acknowledgement. Like learning you have a chronic illness that won't kill you, but will never get better. He was 22 when he told Dr. Martinez he finally understood he would die in prison. She asked how that made him feel. He shrugged. "Annoyed, I guess, but there's nothing I can do about it." Small routines became Kyle's entire existence. Wake at 6 when lights came. Shower if it was his designated day. Eat breakfast in the cafeteria, sitting alone while others clustered in groups. Attend work assignment in the prison laundry, where he folded sheets and towels for 8 hours. Eat lunch. Return to work. Eat dinner. Recreation hour if behavior had been acceptable. Back to cell. Lights out at 10. The same schedule every day with minor variations. Weekends meant no work assignment, but otherwise identical. Holidays were marked only by slightly different food that Kyle barely noticed. Time became meaningless when every day was the same, and the future held nothing different. Some inmates marked their walls with scratches counting days. Kyle never bothered. What was the point of counting toward nothing? His intelligence, which might have served him in a different life, became a curse in prison. He was smart enough to understand exactly how limited his existence was. Smart enough to recognize that he had traded momentary action for permanent consequence, but not smart enough or emotionally equipped to generate the remorse that might have offered some psychological relief. He couldn't regret what he had done because he still didn't value what he had destroyed. He could only regret getting caught, getting sentenced, losing his freedom. His suffering, such as it was, remained entirely self-centered. He didn't lie awake thinking about Emma's last moments or Jennifer's failed attempt to call for help. He lay awake annoyed that his calculations about juvenile justice had been wrong, that his belief in his own specialness had been unfounded. Other inmates occasionally tried to connect with him, usually new arrivals who didn't yet know his story. These attempts always ended the same way. Someone would try to make conversation during recreation or at meals. Kyle would respond with minimal words, offering nothing of himself. The other person would eventually give up, frustrated by the one-sided interaction. A few persistent individuals pushed harder, asking direct questions about why Kyle was there. He learned to say simply, "murder," without elaboration. That usually ended the conversation. Those who pressed for details would eventually learn the full story from other inmates or guards. Then, they would leave Kyle alone like everyone else. He existed in a bubble of isolation that he had created through his actions and reinforced through his complete inability to form human connections. Dr. Martinez wrote in one evaluation that Kyle represented the limits of rehabilitation. He attended therapy because it was required. He participated in prison programs because failing to do so would result in loss of privileges. But nothing reached him. Nothing changed him. He was exactly who he had been at 14, just older and more aware of his circumstances. She recommended continued monitoring and noted that Kyle should never be considered for early release, regardless of future legal changes. He posed the same danger at 25 that he had posed at 14, perhaps more, because he now had decades of resentment added to his fundamental lack of empathy. Kyle read her evaluation when it was shared with him as part of a periodic review. He disagreed with none of it. He simply didn't care what she or anyone else thought. He was alone. He would always be alone. And somewhere deep in his broken psychology, that was exactly what he had always wanted. Rachel stood at the cemetery on a gray November morning, 11 years after the murders. The date had become a ritual for her, a day to visit the graves of the family she had lost. 4 headstones stood in a row under an old oak tree. Jennifer Anderson, beloved sister, mother, teacher. David Anderson, devoted father and friend. Marcus Anderson, forever young. Emma Anderson, our little butterfly. Rachel brought fresh flowers every year on this day, different varieties but always bright colors. Jennifer had loved vibrant flowers, had kept vases of them throughout her house. Rachel wanted the graves to reflect that life and color, even as she stood in the presence of death. Time had softened some edges of her grief, but sharpened others. The immediate shock and overwhelming pain had faded into something more bearable, but also more permanent. She no longer cried every day, had learned to laugh again, to find joy in small moments, to build a life that continued despite the hole torn through it. But certain things still triggered waves of sorrow that took her breath away. Children's laughter that reminded her of Emma. Teenage boys on skateboards that looked like Marcus might have. Women her sister's age living the life Jennifer never got to finish. These moments ambushed Rachel when she least expected them, proving that grief never truly ends. It just changes shape. Rachel had eventually returned to work as a nurse, finding purpose in helping others during their moments of crisis and pain. Her colleagues noticed she had a special gift for sitting with families facing impossible situations. She could hold space for their grief in ways that felt genuine because it was. She understood what it meant to lose everything in an instant. Understood that some questions had no good answers, that sometimes the only response to tragedy was acknowledgement and presence. Her work became a form of healing, a way to transform her own suffering into service. It didn't erase what had happened, but it gave her reason to keep going when grief made existence feel pointless. She had joined a support group for families of homicide victims, finding community with others who understood her specific brand of trauma. They met twice a month in a church basement, sharing stories and strategies for survival. Some members were decades past their losses. Others were newly shattered, still in the acute phase where breathing felt like work. Rachel learned that there was no timeline for healing, no stage where you graduated from grief and moved on completely. The loss became part of who you were, woven into your identity in ways both visible and hidden. She made friends in that group, people who could handle hearing about Jennifer without looking uncomfortable or trying to change the subject. People who understood that sometimes you just needed to talk about the person you lost without being told it was time to move forward. Jennifer's mother, Rachel's mother, had passed away 5 years after the murders. The death certificate listed heart failure, but Rachel knew the truth. Her mother had died of a broken heart, unable to recover from losing her daughter and grandchildren. She had tried to keep living, had gone through the motions of daily existence, but the spark that animated her had been extinguished. In her final weeks, she had spoken often about seeing Jennifer again, about holding Emma and Marcus. She had never once mentioned Kyle, had refused to speak his name after the sentencing. It was as if he had ceased to exist for her, erased from the family story. Rachel understood. Some betrayals were too complete to acknowledge. Her mother was buried next to Jennifer, reunited at last, in the only way that remained possible. David's brother Michael had continued his advocacy work, but with a more measured approach as years passed. He still believed in strong sentencing for violent criminals, but had developed nuance in his thinking. He worked with lawmakers on legislation that balanced accountability with recognition of individual circumstances. He pushed for better mental health screening in schools and more resources for families dealing with troubled children. His grief had been transformed into policy proposals and committee testimony. He would never get his brother back. But maybe, possibly, his work might prevent another family from experiencing what his had endured. It was a small hope, but enough to keep him going. The extended family gathered at Rachel's house after the cemetery visit, a tradition that had developed over the years. David's parents were there, older and frailer, but still present. Jennifer's college roommate came, the friendship having deepened through shared loss. A few of Jennifer's teaching colleagues attended, still missing her presence in their school. Marcus's former soccer coach brought his family. Even Emma's dance teacher stopped by briefly, remembering the little girl with butterfly dreams. They shared a meal together, told stories about the people they missed, laughed at happy memories. It wasn't sad exactly, it was bittersweet, a celebration of lives that had mattered, shadowed always by the violence that had ended them. Someone inevitably asked about Kyle during these gatherings. Where was he now? Had he shown any remorse? Had anyone heard from him? Rachel always shut these questions down quickly. She had no interest in updates about the person who had destroyed her family. Whether he was suffering or content or transformed made no difference to her. He was gone from the world that mattered, locked away where he couldn't hurt anyone else. That was enough. Some family members disagreed. They wanted him to suffer, wanted to know he was miserable. Rachel understood that impulse, but didn't share it. Obsessing over Kyle's experience gave him power he didn't deserve. Her sister wouldn't want her wasting emotional energy on him. Jennifer would want Rachel to focus on living well, on honoring the love they had shared, on building meaning from tragedy. Rachel had started a scholarship fund in her sister's name at the elementary school where Jennifer had taught. Every year it provided money for a student who showed academic potential but faced financial barriers. The recipients were announced at an annual ceremony where Rachel told stories about Jennifer's dedication to education. She showed pictures of her sister in the classroom, surrounded by students who adored her. She described how Jennifer believed every child deserved a chance to succeed, regardless of their circumstances. The scholarship kept Jennifer's legacy alive in a tangible way. It helped children who needed help, which was exactly what Jennifer would have wanted. It gave Rachel purpose and a way to channel her grief into something constructive. As the gathering wound down and guests departed, Rachel stood alone in her kitchen washing dishes. She thought about how far she had come from those first impossible weeks after the murders, when breathing felt hard and getting out of bed seemed pointless, when rage and grief competed for dominance in her chest. She had survived, had built a life that included joy alongside sorrow, had learned to hold both at once, understanding that healing didn't mean forgetting. Jennifer was still gone. Emma would never grow up. Marcus would never land that perfect skateboard trick. David would never coach another game. These truths remained unchanged, but Rachel was still here, still living, still finding moments of beauty in a world that had shown her its ugliest face. That persistence felt like victory, small and quiet and incomplete, but victory nonetheless. Her family's story had ended in tragedy, but her story continued, and every day she kept going was a form of justice Kyle could never take away. Chapter 15. Justice Delivered. 15 years had passed since that November night when Kyle Anderson destroyed his family. He was now 29 years old, housed in a maximum security facility in a remote part of the state. The boy who had smirked in court was gone, replaced by a man with lines forming around his eyes and a body that had settled into the rhythms of prison life. His hair was cut short by prison barbers. His clothes were standard issue, faded from countless washings. He looked like any other inmate, indistinguishable from the hundreds of others serving long sentences. But the emptiness in his eyes remained. That had never changed, would never change. Kyle Anderson at 29 was fundamentally the same person he had been at 14, just older, just more aware of exactly how much he had lost. Dr. Martinez retired after 30 years of prison work, and Kyle was assigned a new therapist. Dr. James Chen reviewed Kyle's extensive file before their first session, reading evaluations spanning 15 years. The consistency was remarkable. Every professional who had worked with Kyle reached the same conclusion. No remorse, no empathy, no meaningful change. Dr. Chen approached their first meeting with cautious curiosity, wondering if perhaps previous evaluators had missed something. The session lasted 45 minutes. By the end, Dr. Chen understood his predecessors had gotten it exactly right. Kyle answered questions with the same flat effect, the same minimal engagement. When asked if he thought about his crimes, Kyle gave his standard response. Sometimes, but it doesn't change anything. Dr. Chen wrote in his initial assessment that continued therapy appeared futile but would be maintained per prison requirements. The legal landscape around juvenile sentencing had shifted somewhat over the years. New Supreme Court rulings had provided additional protections for young offenders, requiring judges to consider age and capacity for change before imposing the harshest sentences. Some inmates sentenced to life without parole, as juveniles were granted new hearings. Appeals were filed on behalf of dozens of offenders, arguing their sentences were unconstitutionally harsh. Kyle's attorneys, court-appointed and overworked, filed similar motions. They argued that brain science supported giving him another chance, that 15 years was enough punishment, that he deserved the possibility of eventual freedom. These motions were denied every time, because judges reviewing his case read the same psychological evaluations, saw the same lack of progress, understood that Kyle Anderson remained dangerous regardless of how much time had passed. Inside the prison, Kyle had achieved a strange sort of equilibrium. He worked his job in the laundry without complaint, followed rules because breaking them resulted in consequences he preferred to avoid, kept to himself during recreation and meals. He had witnessed violence over the years, the kind of brutal attacks that defined life in maximum security facilities. Had seen men beaten, stabbed, sometimes killed over minor disrespect or gang affiliations. These incidents triggered no emotional response in Kyle. They were just events that happened, loud and disruptive, but ultimately not his concern. Guards noted in reports that Kyle was a model prisoner in terms of behavior, but his emotional flatness remained so pronounced that he was never trusted with positions of responsibility or reduced security classification. A journalist working on a long-form piece about juvenile offenders requested an interview with Kyle. The prison granted permission, and Kyle agreed, perhaps out of boredom more than any desire to share his story. The journalist, a woman named Sarah Chen, entered the visiting room with a recorder and a list of carefully prepared questions. She had interviewed dozens of inmates and thought she knew what to expect. Kyle proved her wrong. He answered her questions with honest simplicity that was somehow more disturbing than any lie. When asked if he regretted what he had done, he said, "I regret the consequences for me. I don't like being here." When asked if he thought about his victims, he said, "Not really. They're not here to think about." The interview lasted 90 minutes. Sarah left feeling unsettled in ways she couldn't quite articulate. The piece she eventually published was titled "The Man Who Couldn't Feel." It described Kyle as a cautionary tale about the limits of rehabilitation and the reality that some people simply lacked the capacity for meaningful change. Rachel read that article when it was published. She had avoided most coverage of Kyle over the years, protecting her peace by refusing to give him space in her thoughts. But something about this piece caught her attention. She read Sarah's description of Kyle at 29, still empty, still unchanged, still fundamentally broken. And Rachel felt something shift inside her, not forgiveness, that would never come, but a kind of release. She had spent years angry at Kyle for what he had taken, but reading about his empty existence in prison, she realized he hadn't won anything. He had traded 15 years of youth for a lifetime of isolation in a concrete box. Would trade every year that remained for the same gray walls and meaningless routine. His life was over just as surely as her sister's was. The difference was Jennifer had lived with love and purpose. Kyle existed with neither. His punishment wasn't just confinement, it was being himself forever. Judge Margaret Chen retired at 70, ending a distinguished career on the bench. In interviews about her most significant cases, she always mentioned Kyle Anderson, not because it was legally complex or precedent-setting, but because it had forced her to make the hardest decision a judge could make: sentencing a child to die in prison. She stood by that decision years later, believing it had been correct given the specific circumstances, but she carried the weight of it, understood that she had sealed a 14-year-old's fate with her gavel. She hoped she had been right, hoped that Kyle truly was beyond rehabilitation, because if she was wrong, she had thrown away a life that could have been saved. But everything she had seen suggested she wasn't wrong. Some people were simply born missing something essential, and no amount of time or treatment could create what had never existed in the first place. The world moved on. New tragedies replaced old ones in public consciousness. Mass shootings and terrorist attacks and natural disasters competed for attention and outrage. The Anderson case became a footnote, referenced occasionally in articles, about juvenile justice, but no longer dominating headlines. The house lot where Jennifer's family had lived was now occupied by a modern structure, inhabited by people who had no idea about the history beneath them. Maple Drive looked like any other suburban street. Children rode bikes. Neighbors waved to each other. Life continued in the way it always does, rolling forward despite individual tragedies. The community had healed as much as communities can. The scar tissue was there if you knew where to look. But the wound no longer bled. Kyle's future stretched before him with absolute certainty. More years in the same cell or cells like it. More sessions with therapists documenting his lack of progress. More meals in the cafeteria eating alone. More nights lying awake staring at concrete ceilings. He would grow middle-aged, then old. His body would deteriorate with time and poor prison health care. Eventually he would die, probably in the prison infirmary, surrounded by staff who viewed him as just another inmate. There would be no funeral, no mourners, no one to remember him except as a symbol of something broken in humanity. His name would persist in legal databases and true crime forums, but Kyle Anderson, the person, would disappear as if he had never existed, which in many ways he hadn't. He had never truly been present in his own life, had never connected with anyone or anything, had moved through the world leaving only destruction and then nothing at all. The gavel had fallen 15 years ago in Judge Chen's courtroom. The sentence had been delivered. Justice, such as it was, had been served. 4 innocent people had died. One guilty person would spend his life imprisoned. The scales didn't balance. They never could, because justice in cases like this was always incomplete, always insufficient. Jennifer would never teach another student. David would never coach another game. Marcus would never land that perfect trick. Emma would never see what she might have become. Those losses were permanent and irreversible. Kyle's punishment couldn't undo them, could only prevent further harm and acknowledge that society had noticed what he had done, had declared it unacceptable, had removed him from the community he had proven he couldn't be part of. The system had worked exactly as designed. A crime was committed, evidence was gathered, a trial was held, a sentence was imposed. And still it felt empty, because no system could restore what had been destroyed. No sentence could return the love that had been stolen. Justice had been delivered. But everyone involved understood its limitations, understood that sometimes the best outcome was still fundamentally inadequate. And with that understanding, the world kept turning. The sun kept rising. Life continued for those who remained. And behind concrete walls and razor wire, Kyle Anderson existed in the isolation he had always seemed to crave, forever locked away, forever unchanged, forever proof that some people are beyond saving, and some crimes can never truly be answered, only acknowledged, only remembered, only mourned by those who loved the ones who were lost.